Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating and deeply critical op-ed by former Ambassador Maliha Lodi that was recently published in Dawn. She tackles a massive, incredibly complex paradox right at the heart of our modern world, the actual standing of the United Nations. We're going to map out her arguments and understand exactly what's happening inside this 80-year-old institution that's facing a true crisis of global relevance. So let's dive right in.
So here is the provocative central question we're starting with. It's the question being whispered and sometimes shouted in capitals all over the world right now. Is the UN irrelevant today? Now, according to the source material we're analyzing, the answer isn't just a simple yes or no. It's actually a super fascinating yes and no. You see, it depends entirely on which part of the UN you're actually looking at.
It really comes down to a tale of two very different organizations living under the exact same roof. On one side of the ledger, you've got the argument that the UN is fundamentally irrelevant, mainly because of its glaring, highly public failures in maintaining international peace and security. But then, directly contrasting that, on the flip side, is the argument that the UN remains absolutely vital, functioning as this crucial lifeline in the humanitarian and developmental spheres.
Section 1. Vital humanitarian successes beyond peace and security.
Hey, starting on the side of the argument that says the UN is still vital, just look at the sheer scale of what it achieves on the ground literally every single day. Most of its specialized agencies act as massive first responders in global crises. We're talking assisting refugees, protecting child rights, and setting crucial global norms on massive issues like climate change. One critical example cited in the text is the UN's life-saving assistance for Palestinians in Gaza. The author notes this has been absolutely essential despite facing severe, continuous obstructions. So in these functional day-to-day activities, the UN remains pretty much indispensable.
Section 2. Security Council paralysis, falling short on core mandates.
Now, to understand why the UN is falling so short on its core mission of, stopping wars, we have to look at the structural root of its paralysis, and that's the P5. These are the 5 veto-wielding permanent members of the UN Security Council. The entire system's ability to maintain global peace depends entirely on them. But here's the catch. When the P5's individual interests clash, the whole system just completely freezes up.
Let's look at how that structural power actually plays out in reality using some specific examples from the op-ed. In Gaza, resolutions calling for a ceasefire were repeatedly vetoed by the US. In Ukraine, Russia used its vetoes several times to block action against its 2022 invasion. And during the 2026 US and Israel-Iran conflict, the Council managed to adopt a resolution, sure, but it entirely ignored the root cause of the conflict. The author notes that proponents of realpolitik argue the Council was literally designed this way. It was devised to prevent wars that don't involve P5 interests, but to basically stand completely aside when their interests demand it.
Section 3. A fraying global order, the retreat of multilateralism.
Which brings us to a really deep irony. The rules-based international order is actively being eroded by the very same powerful countries that originally framed those rules. Take this quote from Donald Trump, depicting the UN as useless, outdated, and ineffective. According to the author, Trump actively rejected multilateralism, basically framing it as a surrender of national sovereignty. He even went so far as to establish an alternative board of peace, ostensibly for conflicts like Gaza, to bypass the UN entirely. The author points out that the UN's standing has been severely diminished by what she calls a cavalier attitude from the US, especially abandoning key UN bodies during his administration.
And we see this dynamic laid bare in the specific diplomatic failures during the 2026 US and Israel-Iran conflict. The Council played virtually no role in securing a ceasefire. There was no resolution adopted condemning the initial US-Israeli attack on Iran. A Russian draft resolution that called for de-escalation simply didn't receive enough support to pass. And the resolution that actually did pass, it condemned Iran's retaliatory strikes but totally failed to address who started the war or its root causes. The author argues this selective application of principles shows exactly how power has frequently trumped principles, turning the UN into a mere bystander.
The op-ed also highlights recent comments by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He questioned the UN's utility if it couldn't stop Iranian activities in the Strait of Hormuz. But there is a stark irony here. The author points out that the U.S. has actually done more to undermine the UN, including through massive funding cuts, than any other nation in recent years. It's really a prime example of how powerful states demand action from an institution that they are simultaneously weakening.
And look, this isn't just external criticism either. The alarm bells are ringing from the very top of the institution itself. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon offered this super stark warning. The UN is, in his words, slipping into dysfunction. And the author pairs this with current Secretary General Antonio Guterres' own admission that trust in ailing global institutions is currently at a breaking point.
Section 4. The stalled reform process, an 80-year-old anachronism.
So, if the system is breaking, how do we fix it? Well, the author presents a pretty compelling argument that the UN's architecture is just entirely out of sync with contemporary realities. But reform? It's a remote possibility because of massive gridlock. The international community is deeply, deeply divided. One camp wants permanent seats for themselves, while the other opposes new permanent members entirely, suggesting only elected, non-permanent members. And to top it all off, the P5 have to consent to any reform. And shocker, an 80-year-old bureaucracy isn't exactly about to eagerly relinquish its absolute veto power.
Section 5. The need for legitimacy. Why the world still relies on the UN.
Okay, we've looked at the paralysis, the vetoes, the funding cuts, and the stalled reforms. So you might be wondering, why can't countries simply abandon the institution entirely? Well, it comes down to one single word: legitimacy. For all its flaws, and there are many, the Security Council still holds the ultimate seal of international approval. Countries still go to the Council to secure international legitimacy for their actions and goals. The op-ed points out that this is exactly why Iran wants the UN to endorse a peace agreement once it is finally reached with the US. They desperately rely on the Council to legitimize those agreements on the global stage.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly pressing question. With the new Secretary General about to take the helm amidst severe crises and climate change, can the UN truly be made fit for purpose? Or will its structural gridlock ensure it remains just a mere bystander to a fracturing world? The author's analysis reveals an institution totally caught between vital daily successes and catastrophic diplomatic failures. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Definitely keep this question in mind as you watch global events unfold.